Just a request to everyone to settle down, please. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Data for Justice, a colloquium on criminal justice in India. On behalf of National Law University, Delhi, and the SK Malik Chair on Access to Justice and the India Justice Report, I thank you all for choosing to be with us this weekend and taking time out and engaging with the process. Much of what I have to say and what collectively we have imagined between NLU Delhi and IJR is contained in the colloquium materials that have been circulated in terms of the concept note and the session details. But we are hoping that these will be 2 days of reflecting deeply and critically on the role for data in criminal justice, and it is meant to both explore its potentials, its limitations, and the different ways in which we can think about data. In putting together the group of people who are here today, particular attention has been paid to people who engage with data in different ways and also engage with criminal justice in different ways. And the idea is to have certain provocations, and there are people who are not, and we were very clear that we wanted a multidisciplinary audience, and I hope we have succeeded in some part to do that, because I think lawyers and legal researchers working in this space could do with certain radical provocations on how they engage with data, and that's the idea. So today at for the inaugural panel, we have, and if I may just invite each of them onto the stage, we have Professor G.S. Bajpai, who is the Vice-Chancellor at National Law University, Delhi. Sir, please. Sir. We have Maja Daruwala, who is the Chief Editor of the India Justice Report. Maja? And also Professor Karthik Muralidharan, who is the Tata Chancellor's Professor of Economics at the University of California. Karthik, please. Yeah. In terms of what we'll do now is that we'll have Professor Bajpai's welcome and introductory remarks first, followed by Maja, and then Karthik's keynote address. Professor Bajpai, please.
Yeah, I'll be very good morning to all present, and the entire program is being organized on behalf of the National Law University Delhi by SK Malik Chair, and for which I thank Professor Anup, and of course Maja, who is the architect of this program, and a lot of people to really thank about the whole preparation. But instead of that, I would be coming straight way to give some basic reflections about the way we are actually utilizing the existing set of data to look at the criminal justice system in India. I'm not specifically speaking about those things which are somehow known to us, are somehow going to be discussed in subsequent sessions. So my focus at this stage is only on 2 things. One is, what are our existing capacities to capture the relevant data for criminal justice functioning? Because the core assumption behind this entire program goes the way that we want very important sets of data to enable the criminal justice system to take some informed decision. So data-driven decision-making in criminal justice system is the first requirement for which we need a variety of data. Now, whether the existing set of data are fulfilling this requirement or not is a subject to be very closely audited. If we look at the current styles of data capturing in India at the official level, I divide this data capturing system into two basic ways. One is for which we are more obsessed and engaged at the moment at official level, that is the static data. Static data is something which has been given to us, and we have been somehow working with this static data. What do I mean by static data? Is the data which inform about the profile of the institutions of criminal justice system, 1, manpower in the criminal justice system, 2, resources in the criminal justice system, 3. And these kinds of data are useful, but they do not provide a functional understanding about the criminal justice system. And if you see, I consider it to be a serious implication of this data. This data is needed, but if you see, majority of researches in the criminal justice system have been shaped by the availability of the data. Sometimes availability of a particular set of data would decide the course of research in a particular country. And therefore, if you see the state of criminal justice research, it revolves around those constraints, I would say, which are emanating from the availability of the data. Because individual researchers or even the institutions generally do not have those capacities which require in terms of collecting the necessary data that will help my research to be done. So I'm looking at this static data. Even it is true of police, it is true of prosecution and judiciary and prisons also. We have static data. Now I am bringing the concept of second set of data, which I call it dynamic data or performance data. Dynamic data and performance data is something which we should probably look at, and which we should look at through this in a collective gathering. This is something which we need. So I would say, I will give a couple of examples about the performance or dynamic data. So for instance, and I think through this elaboration, I would also be highlighting two things: data gaps and current capacities. Data gaps, because these are the data gaps for which we do not have data. So if I look at, say, for instance, the FIR registration. So generally, the current data is clearly showing the cases registered with the police. But suppose I'm inclined how many times the police have refused to register the cases for want of various reasons. I don't have that data. In turn, I'm also unable to understand how many people have been refused by the system at the first stage in terms of the fact that their complaint was not good enough to be given attention to. Second, how many times the FIR was not registered and person was asked to the alternatives, options, like going to superintendent of police or going for complaint mechanism. How many times? Surprisingly, we don't have this data. And unless you have this data, you will not be able to understand the true character of the functional criminal justice. Functioning data is missing. Maja's work, India Justice Report on capacity, is also to some extent about static data, and in some cases like legal aid, giving some capacity. Capacity would essentially mean finance, resource, manpower, and all institutional and structural information. I feel collecting institutional and structural information is easy. So we are going by the ease of collecting the data. I think we should place ourselves in those challenges which would bring the functionality of the criminal justice system to the core. Now, second, if I say, what is the trend in terms of investigation completed and the report, final report submitted by the police, what kind of time does it take? What are the grievances at that stage? Or for that matter, charge sheet experiences. We don't know what happens when cognizance is taken, charge sheet is framed, sometimes discharge proceedings took place and cases are discharged. How many cases are brought to that level, and how many are actually get proceeded further, and how many resulted into discharge proceeding, and what are the reasons for discharge? We don't have that data. Unless you have that data, you cannot probably bring a critical comment on the functioning of the police. Third is, we do not have enough data, which is a very crucial aspect, bail. Bail data, we simply have the person who was granted bail. How many hearings it took place, what was the nature of the cases, what kind of time taken, what were the grievances and condition. I think this kind of data has to be gathered. Bail, I personally feel the bail-related data, empirical data is highly needed, and it would include the bail at the level of police and remand experiences, and remand data we don't have. Now, so much discussion is going on police custody and remand, but you cannot conclusively make a statement about the general pattern of granting remands in the police station. And if I go further, case by case, because the peculiarities come to us through the types of cases. So I don't know whether remand experiences are different from the people being taken into custody in rape cases or in general theft cases or murder cases. How do they behave? We don't have. Third is about the collection of data experiences, witnesses' experiences. How many witnesses generally are there? What are their experiences? How the testimony is gathered? How it is documented? How it is put to use? Some kind of data on witnesses. If you see the entire terrain of witness experiences in criminal justice system is a complete mess. And if we want criminal justice system to be informed by that functionality perspective, I think data becomes crucial. At the moment, popular understanding about criminal justice system in this country is gathered by the media report. We make our opinions about the criminal justice through the media reports. I am not saying media reports are completely false, but I am definitely saying that informed understanding and empirical understanding of criminal justice, so nuanced aspects of criminal justice system are not known. Now I come to the victim data. Now victim data is again not at all available, though a lot of victim-centric reforms have been recently done. And there is worldwide voice that we should look at the victims of crime. Now I want to understand that how many times a private lawyer is adopted, because I was initially very interested to know the victim advocate. And CRPC, the 372 proviso was provided where victim was free to engage. Still, I am telling you with complete conviction that we do not know whether in a particular year how many times in how many cases a victim advocate is engaged. Though this is a statutory provision, but exercise of that and utilization of that provision, if it remains a provision and it is not translated into the functioning level, then it means that it is not really functional. Similarly, we don't know the experience of implementing 357A of CRPC earlier. Lot of exercises are available, but this data capturing, because it's a state subject, the compensation schemes have been differently carved out, and a different level of compensation has been assigned for different offenses. But Supreme Court case after case has been saying that even that provision of 357A was not being invoked by the trial court in all the cases which were eligible to be there. So we need the data that what are the, another example for instance, there is a provision of interim bail, interim compensation to be obtained by the victim of crime on the basis of the police report in connection with a crime. Now, can you say with any amount of certainty as to how often does it happen? If we have done a small exercise in a part of Delhi only. In many cases, even the people are not aware. Victim is not definitely aware, even the SHOs are not much inclined to. So which means that these provisions are shallow promises. Because we do not have data to raise a voice that, look, this is happening and there is a need for institutional mobilization to an extent to really see that these provisions are operationalized enough. Now, similarly, if I come to other aspects of nuanced and dynamic data, one part where I always feel that we need to definitely systematically collect the data, that is the aspects of sentencing. Aspect of sentencing is something about which the courts are very tentative in most cases. Not particularly I'm talking about the serious offenses like murder or even in other offenses. So how the court tends to appreciate the aggravating factors and mitigating factors. And what is the general pattern? I mean, when aggravating factors are reduced to the court or when mitigating factors are reduced, what is the trends? So trends in sentencing hearing based on data is something which is again not available. So I would say this is high time. Similarly about judiciary. You know, there could be number of areas about the adjudication of a case. So like if you see in Salem versus Advocate case, the Supreme Court wanted to study the pendency of the cases in different high courts. And they directed the courts to collect the data. And under that exercise, a lot of data was collected. And then we were able to really comment upon the fact that these are the factors which are crucial about the pendency. So I think the capacity of the current system, which is NCRB or for that matter Ministry of Law and Justice, they need to probably hire a better professional team to collect the nuanced data about the operational aspects of the criminal justice system. Because I am of the firm believer, because I have been engaged for several decades in different kind of research, and my research invariably would be informed by limitation rather than choices because of the availability of the data. So our research choices in this country are being guided by the constraints, not the choices. That is the crisis that we are facing on account of the non-availability of the data. Somehow we are not very data-savvy people. We are very opinionated people. That's why I would say the criminal justice research is highly opinionated, highly judgmental, and individual ideas and ideologies are dominating to demonstrate that system functions in a particular way. That is the crisis. This is the high time to see the criminal justice system through the lenses of empiricism rather than ideology or personal. A person may be very rich in experience, but he is speaking from experience. Experience is anathema to empirical research. If you want to attain and maximize the objectivity in research, probably the new ways of capturing the data have to be created. Problem is, I'll finish in saying this, problem is capturing the data through the police station by NCRB or capturing the data of the court by the ministry. This is an easier exercise because it doesn't. But if you see in the UK and US, I have studied the victimization survey very closely. So parallel statistics is being generated in the US and UK, BCS and NCS. These victimization survey are collecting the data in America and UK with parallel to the official statistics. And surprisingly, most researchers in these countries are relying on victimization survey data for their research rather than official statistics. And every time government also come with proud that this is the gap this time between the two sets of data. Sample surveys are. So I think the Ministry of Law and Justice and Ministry of Home Affairs, they have to seriously think to have to set up a department like Bureau of Justice in the US or National Criminal Justice Institute in America. We think that data is a side affair. Some data would automatically be generated when agency would function. But this exercise of ignorance is telling upon the entire course of research in this country. So I suppose, and I always say, while I appreciate that a lot of private organizations and institutions are engaged, but I would insist, and I would say rather firmly, that this should be the official exercise at the best, because this country is very big, the amount of data is too big, individual capacities are always limiting. So I suppose that we need some alternative ways of data capturing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Bajpai, for kicking this off in the manner that you have, and very interesting provocations there. May I say that what is guiding criminal justice research in India, and is our choice in that sense not really a choice, rather than a compulsion of what we are learning about the criminal justice system and what depth we are able to achieve on that. And I'm sure there'll be many reflections on that in the sessions ahead. Next, we have Maja, who's the chief editor of the India Justice Report. And this, of course, the second time that IJR is doing this. Last year, a similar conference was held at the Rajiv Gandhi National University of Law in Patiala, where Professor Bajpai was the Vice-Chancellor then. And the incredible work that the IJR is doing in a very, very difficult space in trying to bring a sense of coherence of understanding criminal justice institutions. So thank you, Maja and Valay and everyone at IJR and the partnering institutions for the work that you've been doing over the years. To set what is the imagination of the session last year and this year and going forward, what is motivating these conversations? Maja, if I may just call you to introduce the colloquium.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I should say immediately that I must apologize for my phone ringing. And it shows the level of technological difference between myself and the other two speakers. They have their phones and they have all their little notes, and I've got a piece of paper with great big font so that I can read off it. So I apologize for being a Luddite. Okay. Thank you for being here. I find myself very lucky to be here, surrounded by people who are deeply committed to making the justice system better. When we speak about better, what do we really mean? Everybody here knows what we mean, but to sum it up, just something that is fair and accessible and available to all. Though it should have been that way already. We shouldn't be here talking about these same things so many years on, but we still have that journey to go through, and building data for justice, which is what this conference is called. Building data for justice is one part, only one part of the process. And clearly, Professor Bajpai has laid out some of the limitations of what we do presently, and maybe is guiding us to what we should also be doing. And some of us are struggling to do in a, as he says, a really difficult space. But we wouldn't be here if we were not committed to doing it. That's the main thing. So a little bit about where I am coming from. For the last 40 years, I've been practicing law. Now, by now I should be perfect at it. But I'm not. Like the law itself, it's not perfect by any means. But the system is working on it, and I am working on it. Like you, my training is rooted in logic, facts, and being a lawyer, dare I say, ethics. After 40 years of research and advocacy aimed at improving systems of justice, I find myself in the India Justice Report, where I discovered the power of data. Maybe that is why I am so affectionate towards it and so fascinated by it, because it's a new love. And better late than never, I suppose. So a little bit about the report, for those of you who don't know the India Justice Report. And I say with emotion, those of you who don't know the India Justice Report, shame. Okay. The India Justice Report is a collective of organizations that works together to assess the capacity of states to deliver justice by examining budgets, infrastructure, human resources, workload, and diversity. Of the 4 pillars of justice, police, judiciary, prisons, and legal aid. We often crunch through hundreds and hundreds of pieces of data to derive indicators through which we arrive at ranking states, and we hope in a defensible and credible manner. The report is evolving. Each report tries to go deeper in more granular and add more institutions such as state human rights commissions, juvenile justice, victimology, touching on all of these things. Through this approach, which is exclusively based on government-generated data, and this many would find problematic, the IJR is able to highlight both progress and persisting failures, make comparisons across geography, across subsystems, and over time. This has a value. It is not an absolute solution to all of the major problems that the criminal justice system is heir to, but it is one part of it. Aggregation allows us to reveal patterns which were invisible, institutional biases that persist, stubborn cultural attitudes. These can be derived from looking at the trends, from looking at patterns. And this data coming all together is one resource in the many resources that are needed to make the criminal justice system better. Disaggregation also points us to that one point in the system which, if it were attended to, would cascade downwards and change many parts of the other system. At least attention to it creates conversations and tensions within the system itself, which do not allow then the system to continue to be static. Through these constant multi-dimensional comparisons, the IJR hopes to provide a reliable tool for policymakers, implementers, and the public to start conversations, but most ambitiously, and this doesn't often get translated into reality, is for all of us to be able to influence a basically closed system, a system that doesn't really want to engage, but to influence policy and improve practice on the ground. That is our ambition. But of course we realize that perspectives, that data standing in isolation, especially the static data that you have spoken about, can provide, they are constrained. They can't provide a full solution to a layered, complex system fraught with challenges. While data can drive a little bit of competition and some improvement, there is also a risk of building on false foundations. We know this, of bad and unreliable data, missing data, misleading data, inconsistent data, and using all this which may really oversimplify a very complex problem. These challenges remind me that before the full potential of good data for justice can be realized, it needs to be informed by different disciplines, tempered with context, and married with the lived experience of what is happening on the ground, both to the people who deliver and have a duty to deliver, and the people who unfortunately have to use the system. And I think that is what Professor Bajpai was pressing upon. Only then can the data contribute to a more humanistic approach to realizing justice. So here we are, inviting all of us to interact for the betterment of justice. This meeting is more than a discussion. It's a space to spark new ideas, build collaborations, tackle shared challenges. For me, it's a chance to learn and to expand our own India Justice Report in many ways. I've already had a conversation this morning with a person I respect a great deal, Ms. Burwankar, who is telling me all of the things that could possibly be done. So I only hope that she will help me on the way to doing them. So there are many hues which can go into implementation, hues of research, that can make rule of law a reality for all. As we go about our work, many big questions abound, and I know that we are all greatly taxed by them. Will excessive use and reliance on data, especially if it's rubbish data, technology, devalue humankind as individual spirits with free will? What are the intentions of those who control data? How much is being collected? How is it being collected? How is it being used? What is being hidden? What is being missing? What is the politics behind it? Will big data eradicate the possibility of human error in justice delivery? Or will it dismantle the fine nuances that human intellect factors in by stereotyping, big modeling, predictive outcomes based on big data, large language modeling, of which I frankly know nothing. So I will be learning all about that as we go along building the India Justice Report. What will justice itself look like when speeding technology leaves millennia of accumulated jurisprudence aside and behind? All this wakes me up at night, so I'm glad of the opportunity to disturb your sleep as well. As we go along our work, self-doubt and dilemmas of too much, too little will dog us. But to keep on going, we must continue to believe that we've added at least one drop of oil in the lamp that lights up some area of darkness and ignorance in a dark and often naughty world. Our institutions of justice have been far too comfortable for far too long with injustice, with convenience, with self-satisfaction. Each time the India Justice Report comes out, some wag will tell me, actually you should have called it the India Injustice Report. But that is too grim a picture to keep smiling at. I really wish that we did not have to bring out the India Justice Report, and that we did not have to constrain ourselves in order to be acceptable to limiting criticism, but leaving it to others to read and to understand and to apply. Now it is our collective responsibility to ensure the promise of justice for all is met, and we have provided our might for it. Ladies and gentlemen, I am conscious that when I opened, I did not use the usual formalities, but I opened without mentioning, though Anup did, that this is an annual conference, and in both these conferences I have had the companionship of Professor Bajpai, first at the NUL and now at the National Law University, Delhi. And so thank you, Professor Bajpai, and thank you for your team, Prerna and Bharti, and thank you to your registrar's office that took such a load of all of the stuff that we did. And of course, I must thank my own team who lead where I follow, especially Valay Singh, who leads the IJR efforts. Honestly, having made the idea of the conference, I sat back and everybody else did the work. So if I looked relaxed, it's because of all these people. In particular, I would like to thank Anup Surendranath, who holds the SK Malik Chair at the NLUD, for the time and the space he has made in his busy, busy schedule, not only to organize the logistics and stuff of the conference, and I've really learned how to look at detail from you, and contributed intellectually to curating the people who are here with immense intellectual rigor, alongside with his own Sancho Panza, Mr. Pulkit, who has tilted tirelessly and silently with him. I don't believe all those emails have come from you. I do not believe it. So it will be a fitting reward for Anup, for the SK Malik Chair, for the IJR Collective, the team, and the university, if we leave here after 2 days with a renewed sense of collaboration and unity of purpose. So welcome and enjoy.
Thank you, Maya, for those generous words. And no, I did not send all those emails. Pulkit had to learn the wonder that is mail merge, how to send out emails. So thank you for those words. And for the keynote today, we have Professor Karthik Muralidharan, who is the Tata Chancellor's Professor of Economics at the University of California in San Diego, and also the author of the book, Accelerating India's Development, a State-Led Roadmap for Effective Governance. And, oh yes. All right. Yeah. Yeah. In this inaugural session and the next session, we have very distinguished economists to challenge a lawyer-dominated audience. Professor Deshpande is also here. And it was very deliberate to have two leading economists come and talk to an audience that is, I guess, quite leaning towards lawyers and law researchers. So I hope, looking forward to both of these comments. Professor Muralidharan, over to you.
While we're waiting for those slides. So thank you so much. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. I'm an economist, and if anything, I think data is everything I do. It's foundational to everything. So I'm really happy to be here and share some of those experiences. But it's also a good time because I finished this major 800-page book, which I think Ashwini, but it's a lot easier, more accessible than it looks. It's about 600 pages of book and 200 pages of notes and references. But it's got chapters on police and public safety, and chapters on courts and justice. And so that, I think, provides a little bit of connection to some of the things I want to talk about. But I think more broadly, my talk, and maybe I'll just start while we wait for the slides. I don't know. I think my computer... yeah, we'll just restart it. Yeah, we'll just restart it. Because... yeah, sometimes you connect it. Okay, so what I'm going to do, let me just start. Okay, let me just start, and we'll let the slides catch up. Okay, so sorry. Okay, I'll just start and we'll let the slides catch up, okay? So basically, I'm a public finance economist, okay? So most of my work of the last 30 years has focused on improving the effectiveness of government service delivery, and with a focus on education, on health, on welfare programs, on early childhood programs. So pretty much every major program that the government tries to deliver, I've kind of worked on improving the effectiveness of these programs. And in the course of doing that, the case for writing this book is the common recognition that across every sector, right, most of our policy discourse, including in justice, happen at a sectoral level, saying what should we do in health, what we do in education. But it turns out that the common issues that affect every sector are common challenges of governance and state capacity. So, and kind of the book itself, therefore, reflects this intellectual journey over 20 years of seeing that the issues are, in fact, remarkably common across every sector. And these sectors have to do with the relative weakness of the Indian state in delivering basic services, okay? So the structure of the talk today is basically going to be in two two halves, where the first 60% is going to be like a capsule synthesis of the book, because these topics of state capacity are going to matter both for justice and how justice interacts with the state, So it's going to be so deeply intertwined, okay? That's kind of one lens that I want to bring to how kind of the legal community thinks about the larger project of justice. And then the second half, I want to talk a little bit more about specific examples of empirical analysis of the law and kind of illustrate the different ways in which data can improve our understanding that in turn can help drive improvements in both equity and efficiency, okay? So if we take a step back and look at India at 75, okay, there are many things to be very proud of, okay? So we are one of the world's fastest growing economies, or the world's largest democracy. Our kind of size makes us inherently important in global affairs. We've got a world-leading diaspora. Our democracy is kind of is the envy of many other countries. So there's a lot going for India, okay? But at the same time, we also face very profound challenges. And these profound challenges are primarily to do with kind of the delivery of public services, right? So education, you've got 50% of children who complete primary school without being able to read at a second-class level, okay? You've got 35% of children who are stunted, who are therefore going to be permanently compromised in terms of their human development. The police are understaffed, undertrained, under-equipped, and overworked, and I'm glad, we have a representative of the police. And the courts are similarly, have severe crises in terms of backlogs of over 30 million cases. And so when you think about where we are as a country, the one simple way of saying this is that Rakesh Mohan, who is one of the architects of the 91 economic reforms, in 2018, when he wrote a review of 25 years of economic reforms, basically said that the way for accelerated growth in India is being held back by weaknesses in public delivery of essential goods and services. Okay, sorry, so here we go. We should be able to get this up and running. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think the Windows tried to install an update and was trying to contact the server, but hopefully that should work. Sorry. The sound should be on the. Oh, yeah, you got to come back. Sorry, thanks for that. Yeah, this is, it's an interesting, it's a Mahabharat-like moment, right? Can Arjuna shoot in the dark, right? You know what I mean? Like, you don't have your slides, and then you got to, you have to do this. So basically, the motivation for the book, like I said, is recognizing that the common thread across 25 years of my work was the empirical finding that the returns to investing in governance and state capacity are often 10 times more than increasing spending on programs in a government as usual way, okay? So what do I mean by that? What I mean is, when you think about increasing, when people say we need to do more for education, the default focus is saying we need to spend more, okay? So every sector associates expenditure with kind of the government's commitment to that sector. But the problem is that the pipes are so weak in terms of the translation of the expenditure into outcomes that if you invest in improving governance and state capacity and service delivery, the return on investment on that is often 10 times higher, okay? And these are examples we see in education. All right, finally, okay, we got that up and running. Yeah, and then if you take that to the slideshow mode, perfect. Okay, fantastic, thank you. All right. Okay, so like I said, is this, I'll turn this on. Yeah, so, so the first part of what I'm trying to do is give you this very, very compressed book talk, and the second part is talk about, wait, why is this now, is it frozen again? All right, it's not a good day for technology. Luddites win. No, you know what? I think I know what happened here. I think my battery just died. Okay, so we're going to have to manually switch this. This is quite suboptimal, but here we go. If you take it down, are you able to hit an enter? If you just hit enter, does it go down? Yes, okay. Unreal. Okay, this is Murphy's law of every possible thing could go wrong. Okay, and then, so I'm going to spend some time talking about the empirical analysis. All right, so let's go down, because I've covered a bunch of this stuff, okay? So let's go down. Down, down, down. Yeah, so I've already talked about all of this. Okay, so basically the simple story of the Indian economy, right? Again, I'm an economist, and most of my time goes thinking about, the overall Indian economy, both in terms of growth and equity. And the simple story here is that the top 10% of the Indian SES distribution basically drives economic growth through a combination of firm creation and having high quality jobs. You've got another 30 to 40% in service sector jobs who are supporting the top 10%, and the remaining 50%, primarily in rural areas, are mostly left out of this growth process and are supported by welfare programs, okay? And so that's kind of why the nature of our politics often revolves around who's announcing the bigger welfare program, okay? So that's just driving where the politics of the country is. Okay, now this model has worked reasonably well, okay? And let's not kind of beat down on ourselves too much, because historically, if you look at the growth trajectories of most countries, the process of growth is accompanied by increasing inequality, and it does take the government to then step in and kind of distribute those benefits more broadly, okay? So in that way, we are not deviating from kind of the historical norm of how countries have grown. And so while you look at massive inequality and that can seem very disconcerting, this is not a historical outlier, okay, relative to what growth processes have looked like, okay? So let's go down. So I think the real challenge is that, can you go down, please? Yeah, okay. Yeah, this is not ideal. All right. So the real challenge, of course, is that while the model has worked reasonably well, you can't function at full potential if you're not firing on all engines, okay? And that basically means being able to invest in the human capabilities of the lower 50% of the SES distribution to be able to empower them to not just be passive recipients of welfare, but to be active contributors to personal and national progress, okay? And this is critically constrained by weak state effectiveness in delivering essential public goods and services, including the rule of law and environmental quality, okay? So let's go down. And yeah, so let's go down. So this is the Rakesh Mohan quote. And then Land Pritchett is always a bit more colorful, right? I mean, in 2008, he had this great quote saying that the weak performance of the Indian state is one of the 10 greatest challenges facing humanity, okay, on the order of climate change. And that reflects both, I think, the scale of the problem and the number of people affected. And so this is kind of what motivates the book, which is, as we assess India at 75, there's perhaps no greater barrier to achieving full potential than improving the effectiveness of the Indian state, okay? So let's go down. So what the book is, it's 18 chapters, and there are kind of the two core sections are these middle sections of building an effective state and accelerating development. But before we do that, I'm going to take a 5-minute historical detour, and you'll see why, okay? So let's come down. So when we think, so if you just go down, right? So if you think about state capacity itself, okay? Sorry, just wait. Yeah, go back up, yeah. So if you think about state capacity itself, right? It's not correct to say that the Indian state is weak in everything, right? Because we do certain things amazingly. We run the world's largest elections. We run the biggest vaccination campaigns. We run the most cost-effective moon mission ever, okay? We manage the Kumbh Mela, which is one of the logistically most challenging tasks any government in the world would ever take on, okay? So it's not correct to say that the Indian state is not capable. The Indian state is actually very capable. But it's very capable in mission mode, okay? When you have to get something done in a time-bound way, where all of the resources are focused on making that happen, but where it kind of does much more poorly is in the routine daily delivery of essential goods and services, okay? So when you want to think about state capacity, the framework of Francis Fukuyama becomes very useful. You think about the scope of the state and the strength of the state, right? So the scope is what does the state try to do, and the strength is its effectiveness at doing that, okay? And I think the key thing that I want to call attention to is if you look at the evolution of the modern nation state over a 2,000-year period, okay? For most of human history, countries were essentially security states, okay? Where the main thing you did was external defense and law and order, okay? And one way of seeing this is about 70 to 80% of budgets in 17th century Europe was going to defense. If you look at Roman archives, Egyptian archives, 80% of budgets were basically going to defense, okay? So, because that was the existential crisis that you had to do to protect your borders and secure law and order, okay? So let's go down. So it's only in the 19th century, alongside the Industrial Revolution, let's go down, please, that you get the modern industrial state, okay? Where you get, for the first time, the government start kind of taking taxpayer money to build large-scale public infrastructure, roads, railroads, canals, public sewage systems, mass education systems. So all of this starts happening only in the 19th century, okay? And it's not an accident that this happens alongside the Industrial Revolution. Why? Because now, for the first time, you have economies of scale in production, and so it makes sense to produce in a concentrated way and invest in the transport, okay? But this is also then the period, for the first time, you get massive increases in in economic growth, okay? So till then, you're broadly in this Malthusian equilibrium where when there's growth, the population also grows, okay? So the per capita income doesn't change for about 3,000 years of human history, okay? It's only in the 19th century that per capita income starts going up for the first time, okay? And that's coming with the Industrial Revolution. But alongside that comes massive increases in inequality, okay? Which is what I talked about, because the benefits of this growth process go to people with physical capital, that's land, financial capital, that's money, and human capital, that's education, okay? So then let's go down. You get to the third phase of the state, which is the modern welfare state, okay? And the welfare state is actually less than 100 years old, where now governments come in and saying, let's use progressive taxation to then run major welfare programs, food security, healthcare, pensions, unemployment insurance. So all of this shows up only in the last 100 years, okay? So the two key points I want you to take from this, because this is going to be important for understanding India in this global context, is the first is that welfare states are very expensive to build, okay? So most high-income countries built welfare states at a GDP per capita of about $20,000, okay? So that's the first thing. The second key thing, let's go down, which is kind of why I'm giving you this detour, is that the scope of the state, and this is going to be central for everybody who thinks about rights, okay? The scope of the state is highly correlated with the extent of democracy, okay? And so basically what happens is that the security state is at a time when there's no concept of individual human rights. The king can pick up anybody and throw you in jail. You go to Middle Eastern, you go to medieval Europe, there'll be these torture chambers, dungeons, you could do what you want in the interest of security, okay? The 19th century industrial state is a very interesting period. So the US and the UK like to think of themselves as great old democracies, but these are highly flawed democracies, right? Because the vote was restricted to white property owning men, okay? Were the only people who had a vote in the 19th century. And so what that means is that this is the class that is voting for infrastructure, okay? Because in the long term, roads and railroads are helping the poor through market integration and lower prices. But in the short term, the benefits are going to those who own the land, okay? So who is then the political class that is voting for the infrastructure? It is because this is the group that has the vote. And it is not an accident that you only get the welfare state after universal franchise, okay? That the expansion of voting rights is what then drives the welfare state, okay? And that's because in any income distribution, if I'm on the left of the average, I want higher taxes and more redistribution. If I'm on the right, I want lower taxes, okay? And this is the core tension in US politics even today, okay? So the Republicans are kind of the 19th century Democrats who are willing to vote for infrastructure and defense, but not for welfare. Okay? So it's not an accident that the expansion of the franchise is so strongly correlated with the nature of the state itself. And then it also deeply affects the nature of the laws, right? So the evolution of laws also reflects these phases of the state, where this 19th century version is putting constraints on the sovereign. So the US Constitution doesn't care that much about social justice or equality, but it's mainly about putting constraints on the government from expropriating private property, right? So that's kind of that 19th century element, this thing. And then the modern kind of idea of giving citizens more rights, which we see in India, is very much a consequence of the universal franchise, okay? So why am I giving you this history? Let's go down. Okay, so the first is just to see that the modern welfare state, so this is just kind of the fraction of public expenditure that goes to welfare, and you'll see that till about the Great Depression, there's nothing, okay? You get a little bit after the Depression, but the big pickup in welfare spending happens after World War II, okay? And that's because welfare states are expensive, and before you can do welfare, you need the tax capacity, the fiscal revenue to be able to do that. But that requires not just the administrative ability to tax, it requires the political willingness to tax and be taxed, okay? So historically, populations are willing to be taxed at existential moments of crisis like wars, okay? So World War II is what gives you the fiscal capacity, because the tax rates go up, and the administrative capacity to run large government programs, because the government basically was running most parts of the economy, right? And then with the peace dividend, you kind of convert both that fiscal and administrative capacity towards delivering more welfare, okay? So the welfare state is a remarkably modern phenomenon, okay? Now let's go down. The second point, why am I giving you this 5-7 minute history, is to make sense of India, we need to recognize that India is this incredible outlier in human history, right? That we are the only country that had universal adult franchise basically on day one, okay? So what this democracy, so this is just on that picture at a comparable level of GDP per capita, the US and the UK would be, this is from Arvind Subramaniam and Rohit Lamba. would have kind of about 2.5 on that index, and that's roughly corresponds to the fraction of people who have a vote, okay? And so in India, that's high and stays high, okay? So so a lot of political scientists have talked about kind of the miracle that's Indian democracy, right? I think what has not been analyzed enough is the downstream consequences of that for the trajectory of the Indian economy itself, okay? So let's go down. Now, at one level, this is a huge moral triumph, okay? So the reason our democracy is something we're so proud of is that it has allowed every Indian, including the most marginalized, to participate in the political process, okay? Well before their counterparts in other countries. So this is why we're also proud of our democracy and why kind of this gives us so much soft power. Let's go down. And it has also led to substantial policy wins for the poor. Okay, so for example, I find this example really powerful. India does PDS for the poor for food security at a GDP per capita of about $1,200, $2011 PPP adjusted, okay, in the 1960s. Whereas the US does food stamps at $18,000. So they wait to get 15 times richer, okay, before they are able to do food security for the US population. India did school midday meals, like starting in the 60s and 70s and scaled it up. Even today, I mean, Tim Walz, who's the Democratic vice presidential candidate, is proud of the fact that they just introduced school meals in Minnesota, like in the US, okay? This happened in the past 3 years, okay? So it gives you a sense of how much the democracy has been a moral achievement in terms of empowering the poor with both a voice and with real policy wins, okay? But that's the glass half full part of the story, okay? Let's go down. The glass half empty part is that this also creates two fundamental challenges, okay? So the first fundamental challenge is the public finance challenge, okay? Which is that when you're so poor, it's not only that the people are poor, the government is also poor, okay? And that's because the tax to GDP ratio is lower in poor countries, okay? So the government just doesn't have the money. And so when you have both voter demand and political supply of welfare, what that means is you don't have the resources for investing in public goods, including the state itself. So when we see why are we so chronically underinvesting in every part of public state capacity, whether it's the police, whether it's the judiciary, whether it's every part of that, and that's partly because there's a limited budget, okay? So the problem is not welfare, okay? So let's be very clear. The problem is not welfare. The problem is the poor quality of welfare spending, and that's because you're trying to run these schemes before you built the administrative and fiscal capacity to do that, and that's why you had high rates of leakage and inefficient welfare spending. So the problem is not welfare. The problem is the quality of welfare spending, okay? So let's go down. And then you get a second problem, which is then the political economy problem. And this is now something that we see in Africa, we see in many early democracies, right? Where essentially there's almost an Orientalist Western political science way of saying, oh, these are clientelist democracies. But all of this makes sense once you understand that you're functioning in a world of limited resources. So when the resource base is so limited, the nature of politics becomes, how do I direct the resources of the state towards my base vote group, as opposed to building broad-based public services, okay? So the demand for the vote bank politics comes from the fact that the state voters and politicians know they don't have resources to cater to everybody, okay? So then the nature of politics becomes this vote bank politics, and that creates another vicious cycle where you are taking the resources of the state towards narrow groups as opposed to building broad-based state capacity, okay? So that then creates these two vicious cycles. So you go down, and it leads to a chronic underinvestment in the capacity of the Indian state to meet the democratic aspirations of its citizens, okay? So let's go down. And so this is why I think, so let's go down all the way, right? So the basic summary, right? So this is why political scientists like Ram Goha, in his famous book on India after Gandhi, his final kind of assessment of Indian democracy is 50-50, okay? Ashu Varshni writes in 2013, battles half won, okay? So how do you interpret this? And my interpretation of this is that the glass half full is that Indian democracy has given every citizen the capacity, the ability to make a claim on the state, okay? But it has not given the state the capacity to meet those claims, and which is why kind of my contention of this book is that building a more effective state is in fact the great unfinished agenda of Indian democracy itself, okay? So, because if you want to fulfill what Dr. Ambedkar famously said, how do you translate the one person, one vote in the political sphere into something closer to equality in the economic sphere? And at least the base aspect of this has to be equality of essential opportunities, whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's safety, whether it's access to justice, which are the things we're talking about. But every one of these facets of the state is we are constrained by underinvestment in the state itself, okay? So let's go down. right? And then, yeah, so and sometimes I think, particularly for those outside the government, whether it's the citizens or activists, right? It's very easy to blame the bureaucracy and saying, okay, the bureaucracy doesn't deliver, the bureaucracy needs more pressure. But if you go look inside, you will feel incredibly sympathetic to both kind of the politicians and the bureaucrats, okay? And that's why that chapter 2 is called the politician's predicament, and chapter 3 is called the bureaucracy's burden, okay? And the burden of the bureaucracy is that they're just chronically understaffed. So the Indian state is the most understaffed relative to any other major country in the world. You've got limited and misdirected accountability. So, you know, the managerial tools are limited. There's inadequate autonomy, okay? There's also much more over-centralizing. There's poor capacity, skills, and opportunities. It's a paperwork state, which is essentially, again, a colonial legacy, and you've got lack of tenure and managerial stability, okay? So when you go inside and look at the conditions, and that's why the book is really talking about systems and not people, you'll kind of, it's not a surprise that this is a system that is not able to deliver, okay? So let's go down. And why is this the case? I mean, there's a whole bunch of factors, including, you know, the colonial legacy, right? I mean, that this was a state that was built to extract and not to serve. And then there's a whole bunch of factors. A couple of things I want to highlight are, one, there are judicial factors that actually may be well-intentioned, but actually contribute to weakening state capacity, okay? And in particular, this is the issue of personal litigations by government employees themselves, okay? So the number of court cases that are run by government employees that kind of paralyze the government. So there are states I've worked in where for 4 years or 5 years, positions of block education officers have been vacant because different cadres are kind of, arguing about seniority rules, and it goes to the court. It sits in the court for 5 years, and no appointments are made for 5 years, okay? So there's this book on state capability by Dr. T.V. Somanathan, who just became cabinet secretary, where he says personal litigation within the government is like a tapeworm, okay, that enervates the ability of the system to function from the inside that people on the outside are not aware of, okay? So there are ways in which the judiciary also contributes, though it might be well-intentioned. And then there's a whole bunch of these factors, which I'm not going to have time for. But if you go down, the simple summary of this is that India has not yet completed the transition from a colonial state designed to rule the population to a democratic state designed to serve them, okay? And this applies perhaps even more to the judiciary, okay? So I haven't kind of gone into the innards of that, but talking to Maja, talking to others, I think that basic relic still remains in key aspects of the state, okay? So let's go down. So the point of this book, and the reason it's 600 pages, is not just to say this is a problem, right? I think the key point is to not just diagnose, but to offer an implementable roadmap for what are the things that we can do to build a more effective state, okay? And so the first part of this is kind of saying, opening up the black box of state capacity, because it sounds like very vague, okay? So what does this mean, right? And what I've done here is take these 6 core ideas that come from organization theory, right? So any organization, whether it's public or private, what determines organizational effectiveness, and that's why I'm happy this conference is about data. Like, the foundation is data. Any company, how do you manage yourself? It is, what is the data, what are the metrics, what are you tracking? Okay, what is that quarterly kind of, what are you being held accountable for? And that's kind of almost the North Star of where the org itself goes towards, okay? So the data is foundational. And then there's personnel, right? I mean, how are you hiring, how are you paying, how are you promoting, what characteristics within the organization are being rewarded? There is public finance, there's expenditure, which is where are your budgets going? Are you allocating your budgets to the things that are effective or not? What is your revenue model? There's federalism and decentralization, which is a cross-cutting issue. And then there's the state and the market, which is, so again, if you're a company, if you're a global MNC, you have to decide what is going to happen in the global headquarters, in the national headquarters, in the field office. And that's the same thing in a complex federal system, deciding what decision happens at what level. And the state and the market is then the same thing, deciding what am I producing internally, whereas what am I going to source from outside, where there might be a better, more competent provider, okay? So these issues that kind of I've highlighted are issues that transcend any kind of organization, okay? And then the structure of each chapter is, the first half is kind of a diagnosis, what I call science or social science, and the second half is solutions, what I call engineering or systems engineering, right? So, and again, so Greg Mankiw has this nice 2006 JP piece where he talks about the economist as scientist and engineer, where you're saying one part of what you're doing is trying to understand the world, and that's a scientist. And the second part is using that understanding to build a better mousetrap, okay? So that's the engineering piece. So every chapter is structured that way. So what I'm going to do, let's go down, is just give you one slide from each of those first 3 chapters. And because this is a data conference, see, I think what Maja and IJR are doing is amazing, but you're just kind of starting on a journey that Pratham kind of started in 2005 in the context of education, okay? So, and this is why this is going to be such a long, hard slog, okay? So this is kind of a very, very simple figure on education, okay? So from a paper by my colleague Abhijit Singh. So what that left-hand graph shows is, this is official data, okay? What Professor Bajpai mentioned, what everybody mentioned this morning about how much can you trust official data, okay? So this is official data on learning outcomes in Madhya Pradesh. And in fact, this was considered a best practice because they tried to test every child, put the learning levels, and create these learning improvement plans for every child, okay? So that is on that top line. And you see this is sorted from the weakest kid to the strongest kid. And you see that nobody is scoring below 65%, okay, in Hindi, and nobody is scoring below 60% in maths. And then what Abhijit did was just did a very, very simple audit study where they went back to the same schools and retested a sample of the same kids on the same questions, okay? That is in the official test. Identical, okay? And in that audit, you see the true scores are kind of dramatically lower, okay? So in the official data, there is no child who scores below 60%. In the independent data, there's no child who's scoring above 60%, okay? Now, this sounds, I mean, it's induces a laugh. But this is such a tragedy, right? This is how we have wasted 20 years as a country, okay? Because since 2005, Pratham has been out there saying that we have a learning crisis. But even if a joint secretary in private will admit there's a problem, officially the government has to use official data. And in the official data, there's no crisis because official data is all made to look good, okay? And this is the same in every sector, every state, okay? So even high-functioning states like Tamil Nadu, right, I have seen that in the official data, the rate of severe malnutrition is 1%, whereas in the independent data, it's about 8%, okay? Now, why does this matter so much? Because the entire policy approach we have is to say when you have a malnourished child, you increase the food allowance. But if you don't classify the child as malnourished, then you kind of, the entire system can't do what it's supposed to do, which is why the data then becomes foundational to effective state capacity, and which is why I'm happy we have this entire 2-day conference. But, you know, what you can see there in that chapter is both talking about the concepts and certain practical ideas. And maybe in the Q&A, I'll talk about one of the citizen surveys we've done in Telangana that can provide, I think, what Professor Bajpai was talking about, independent citizen-based reportings on public safety, which might kind of skew some of the reporting problems we have in crime. Okay, so let's go down. So this is just personnel showing you that the Indian state is perhaps the most understaffed relative to population in the world, with about 16 per thousand. I mean, there are some contractual employees who may not be here, but overall you see that's kind of, even the US that we consider a paragon of market economy is about 77, and Scandinavian countries about 10 times higher, okay? But one reason for this is that the Indian government employees, except the very top, are among the most overpaid in the world, okay? So if you look at global studies of kind of public sector pay premiums, you actually see that the Indian government employees are the highest paid. So this is for teachers from one of my studies, where you see that the average government school teacher salary is about 6 times higher, okay, than the average private school salary. And this is, you know, and the numbers are different, but that basic pattern. So the one-line summary of kind of personnel in India is we pay too much and we hire too little, okay? And now study after study shows that augmenting state capacity with locally hired staff who are not necessarily, the problem is we fetishize exam-based recruitment to get this highly qualified candidate, but they live in district headquarters and don't want to live in the village. So a big part of the problem of the absence comes from the fact that there is this social and spatial disconnect between your employees and the communities they have to serve. And if you look at some of our most effective models, they usually come from upskilling people in the community who want to be there, rather than trying to hire talented kind of folks through an exam who have no desire to be in the community that they have to serve, okay? So again, but all of this is coming from years of research, okay? So the book, it looks like 600 pages, but it's like I've read 60,000 pages to write that 600, right? So synthesizing a much broader body of evidence that now points to certain low-hanging fruit of how we can improve state effectiveness, okay? So let's go down. So this is, I think, conceptually one of the key pictures in the whole book, okay? And it's in the public finance chapter. And basically, how should we think about quality of public expenditure, okay? So if you're in a private company, if you're a CFO, you're not going to be allowed to spend 10 crores or 100 crores without doing a detailed discounted cash flow analysis and saying, what is the return on investment of this particular spending, okay? Whereas in the government, you can routinely spend thousands of crores without anything close to that kind of discipline, okay, on kind of the economic returns to that spending. But you may come back and say that, listen, government is also about justice, is also about equity. We We are not a private company. We are not just about return. Absolutely, okay? But you can also take every major public spending item and analyze it on equity, okay? And saying, what is this doing for efficiency, which is ROI? What is it doing for equity, okay? And then you get this very simple 2x2 framework to look at every major public spending program. And what you'll see is, a lot of our public discourse happens over region 2 versus region 4, okay? There are some ideas that can improve efficiency but hurt equity. So for example, moving to a uniform GST would be an example that would improve efficiency of tax compliance a lot, but hurt equity because it would be regressive, okay? And then we have other policies like PDS that help equity, but are arguably inefficient in terms of what they do to the agriculture markets, okay? But my bigger point to highlight in this book is we have so many ideas that are in region 1 that would improve both equity and efficiency, which we are not doing because we say we don't have the money. On the other hand, there are so many things we spend that are bad for both equity and efficiency, okay? So to just take the example from rural farmer welfare, okay? You have a program like NREGA, which is outstanding for both equity and efficiency, okay? And that's kind of what the research shows. On the other hand, you have free electricity for farmers, which may be one of the worst policies we do because the top 5% of landowners get about 50% of the subsidy. It's a disaster in terms of efficiency for the water table and what it does for cropping, but we still do it and call it farmer welfare, okay? So part of the point of the value of data and analysis is to then just subject all of our major public decisions to a certain conceptual clarity and scrutiny that comes from the data, and saying, while reasonable people can disagree about region 2 and 4, can we at least build a national consensus, like, to identify items in region 3 and cut spending there so that we can do more in region 1, okay? So let's go down. Okay, I'm just going to take 5 minutes, sir, because of the initial technology glitch, okay? So this is, I think, so why am I optimistic, okay, despite all of this? So this is one of the great development debates over the past 50 years or 60 years, okay, and what's been called the growth versus development debate, okay? So on any major human development outcome, if you look at the correlation between income and outcomes, richer countries do better, okay? Richer countries have better education, better health, better everything, and so the growth wallas will say, get 2% higher growth going for 30 years, and everything else will take care of itself, okay? So that you really need to focus on growth. On the other hand, you have the development folks, led prominently by Amartya Sen, who would say that the point of development is not GDP per capita, the point of development is enhancing human capabilities, okay? And so hence the focus on education, health, and social sector, okay? Now, my point of departure on this debate is that at some level they're both right, okay? So clearly more growth helps human development and more human development helps growth, okay? So what are we arguing about? And the argument ends up being more ideological, where the center right wants to do capex and growth and the center left wants to do social sector spending. And my point of departure is that the efficiency of our spending is so poor, regardless of whether you're doing capex or whether you're doing social sector, that you can do more of everything by using better data and evidence to improve the quality of public expenditure, okay? So the case for optimism, let's go down, comes from this picture, which is a very famous paper by Sam Preston in 1975, and the x-axis is the GDP per capita, the y-axis is life expectancy, and that graph shows you from 1930 to 1960 that that shifted up, okay? And if you look at that now in 2015, that's shifted further up, okay? So the point of this is to say that over time, at any given income, we are able to achieve better outcomes, okay? Even without waiting to get rich. And the key to this, how is this possible? And the key is new technology and new data, okay? So, and the one example of this is in 1924, 100 years ago, the president of the US could not save his son from a blister that came from a little bacterial infection playing tennis, okay? And that's because there was no antibiotics, no germ theory of disease, and his son passed away in a few days, okay? So today, that would not be a problem at all, okay? So the way to think about this, why am I giving you this example, is that all human progress, or most human progress, has come from the creation of new knowledge, the transmission of that knowledge, and acting on that knowledge, okay, to then deliver benefits at scale. So when we go down and saying, how can we shift this Preston curve for governance more broadly? What we should ask is, what does India have today that today's rich countries did not have 50 years ago? Let's go down. And what we have is much better data and much better evidence, okay, on the quality of expenditure that then allows us to deliver more with the same amount of money. So if you And we have much, much, much better technology that can be used to improve the quality of governance. So let's go down. So most of my own research over the past 20 years has documented that many very, very expensive policies and programs, like these large unconditional pay commission salary hikes, have little to no impact, okay, on outcomes, but much more inexpensive interventions, like hiring a second Anganwadi worker, like in the communities, ends up having a massive positive effect with an ROI of about 20x, which will improve both equity and efficiency, okay? But we're not doing it because most of that money goes to increase salaries of existing workers who are politically much more powerful, okay? So that's one example. But there is sector after sector, we have tons of examples. And so now, the reason research and evidence in public spending is so important is, as an economist, I don't worry about how does Maruti produce cars, okay? And that's because you're facing market prices for inputs and market prices for outputs. So if you're not efficient, you're going to get competitive pressure to be efficient, okay? Whereas governments can spend other people's money badly for a very, very long time, okay? So when you're in the public sphere where there is no market test, the value of research is especially high, because how else are you going to guide and get the feedback to improve the effectiveness of public spending, okay? So let's go down. And so the whole point here is that even if you grow at 8%, so at 6% growth, we will end up in 2047 with 16% of kids still not being able to read. Even if you take that to 8% growth, you only get there in 2046. But if you can double the effectiveness of public spending going forward, you dramatically bring forward that process, and that's an extra 100 million kids who will complete school being able to read in the next 10 years. So let's go down. Okay, so let's skip this. I do want to take 5 minutes, okay, on the second half of the talk on the law. Okay, so let's come down. Right, so the judicial system faces many of the same challenges as the bureaucracy, right? The court system is understaffed, under-resourced, plagued with procedural inefficiencies, and bursting at the seams. Okay, let's go down. And again, this hurts both individual justice. We've got, 2/3 of people who are kind of under trial and incarcerated waiting trial, which kind of makes a complete mockery of the idea of innocent until proven guilty. But it also hurts economic activity, okay? So it's both intrinsically bad and instrumentally bad, okay? And this seems even more difficult to fix, okay, than the bureaucratic problems. Because every time I've tried to talk about this, like chief secretaries have said, listen, coordinating with the judiciary is impossible, okay? Because it's like even harder because everything's centralized in the office of this chief justice, who often has such a short tenure that you're not able to have any meaningful action on this, okay? So in many ways, it's an even more wicked problem about how are we going to get moving on this. But this is where data and analysis can be a critical catalyst of improving both equity and efficiency in the judicial system. Okay, so let's go down. And what I want to highlight is these close interplay, right, between law, justice, and state capacity. That, weak state capacity hurts the protection of negative rights, right, which is, we want certain individual rights to be respected in kind of a police process that often doesn't happen because the police often do not have the resources to follow the law, okay, and which is partly may explain the public support for extrajudicial actions. It also hurts the delivery of positive rights, okay, so the legal enactment of positive rights, employment, education, food, information has been a key strategy for progressives to build a more just and inclusive society. But the translation of these laws into improvement is critically limited by weak state capacity for implementation. Okay, so one of my major studies in Andhra, this is the one, Ashwini, that was just in Econometrica last year, shows that improving the implementation was more effective than rolling the law itself. Okay, so most of our focus happens at the level of passing laws, right? But the implementation is remarkably unglamorous. Okay, and we don't spend our time then looking at the translation from law and budgets down to the field. And again, it just shows the centrality of investing in that. And conversely, and I think this is the maybe slightly provocative point I wanted to leave with this audience who are primarily motivated by justice, right? Which is that judicial interventions can also weaken state capacity, okay? So if you kind of take on, accept cases that you're then not able to solve, and they're sitting there for 20 years, so administrative litigation within the government is a great example of this, okay? So tribunals were set up to potentially clear this, but because you accept appeals even after the tribunal, it's not helped at all, and just added another layer that has further kind of just calcified these issues within the government, okay? Let's go down. And then the other subtle point is that litigation to secure positive rights for individual plaintiffs can often make things worse for the poor on average, okay? So the number of education secretaries who tell me they spend 30-40% of their time essentially responding to court summons, because you have individual cases who are going to court and saying that I have not gotten this entitlement under law. The courts try their best to give you justice in that individual case, okay? But because the problem is the system doesn't have the capacity, what you're not observing is how you're diverting the capacity of the system to give you justice in that one case, which in turn is further reducing the average capacity of the system, okay? And that is something that's, so it's an intellectually and epistemically different framework, right? Kind of economists and lawyers. Because in law, we think about justice at the level of the individual case. As economists, we think much more about the performance of the system as a whole. And so often these two goals can be in conflict if in kind of providing justice in the individual case, you're diverting systemic capacity in ways that you're not paying attention to, okay? So this is not to say that you don't do the individual justice, but you have to pay attention to kind of the cost of compliance that you're imposing in that process. And often you will do much more for the poor by augmenting capacity, right, of the system rather than by passing new entitlements, okay? So just since I lost 5 minutes, I'm just going to wrap this up. Let's go down. Okay, and so this is illustrative of what Land Pritchett has called premature load bearing, okay, which is, and the example here is if you're a weightlifter, okay, and you're training to get progressively strong, the way you need to train is every time you lift 2 or 3 kilos more than your last one, so that bit by bit your muscles build the capacity. But if you try to lift 100 kilos suddenly, you'll fall and you'll die, okay? So similarly, if you try to do more than what you have capacity for, you can actually tie your system further in knots, and that's something that we're not paying enough attention to, okay? So let me give you 2 examples. And this is a very difficult one, okay? It's a very difficult one, but it's an example of kind of the importance of data and empirical research, okay? So there's a classic paper by Kaushik Basu that shows how child labor bans can improve welfare, but this only holds under perfect enforcement. And he shows theoretically that this can reduce welfare under weak enforcement, okay? So let's go down. And then this paper by my colleague Prashant Bharadwaj looks exactly at this, and he finds exactly that this 86 Child Labor Act actually led to a decline in child wages, an increase in child labor, okay, and a reduction in school enrollment. Now, why is this? Let's understand the economics, okay? It's that parents are not sending their kids to work because they don't like their kids. They're sending their kids to meet certain minimum income requirements of the family, okay? So what the Basu model shows is if I can get perfect enforcement by taking the children out of the labor supply, adult wages go up enough that you get to the high quality equilibrium where you don't need the child labor to meet the income. But what happens under imperfect enforcement is that you go away from factories, which is monitorable, but you take that work and take it home, okay? So the productivity has gone down, the wages have gone down, but you now need more child labor to meet that old income target that you needed as a family, okay? So it's a very, very difficult moral case, okay? So this is not to say that we shouldn't have these laws. Let's go down, because the laws still serve a purpose of a statement of social values, okay? But it just highlights that good intentions can sometimes and often make things worse in settings of weak state capacity, okay? So I think in general, for people focused on justice, right, the simple way to think about it is a lot of the justice movement focuses on taking a fixed pie and directing it towards the marginalized, okay? But in a world where the fundamental constraint is the overall capacity of the system, and that the Indian welfare state itself is ahead of its time in terms of our fiscal capacity, focusing on interventions that enhance capacity is going to be a much bigger long-term win. So on the positive note, so this is a recent study by a postdoc of mine, and this is a really, really powerful study looking at district judge vacancies. And so what she shows is that increasing the number of district judges significantly improves court efficiency, clearing about 200 pending cases per year, reducing the backlog. But more importantly, because about 60% of these cases are land and credit, okay? And these are factors of production that are being locked up because they're not being productively used, that every extra district court judge, she estimates, significantly increases the total lending by banks and credit volume, let's go down, and increases total economic activity. And she estimates that the total economic gains are 30 times the cost of hiring this extra judge. And that the increase in tax revenue itself is six times the cost, which means augmenting that judicial capacity is a self-paying investment that's going to have an ROI of infinite, okay? So I'm done, so let's just go to my last concluding slide. And I just want to highlight again the centrality of this equity efficiency framework, right? That a lot of our justice kind of discourse focuses on kind of equity, correctly so. But in a world of limited resources and capacity, often that can give you short-term wins, but not get you systemic wins. Whereas if you manage to identify interventions at the intersection that improve efficiency and equity, you can do do more of everything, and that's going to be the most sustainable way of kind of improving equity itself. Okay, so my last slide, just go down, and yeah, let's go through all of this, right? So again, like I said, it is a very, very difficult slog. Even in education and health, most of us who've been working on this collect our own data, okay? Because administrative data is often just not reliable. In the case of courts, at least there are more legal recourses to kind of getting the data that you need, and that needs to be a top priority. But better data can really catalyze improvements in justice in several ways. The first is just finding and presenting facts to stimulate the public conversation, which is what IJR does, what Aparna Chandra's recent book does, right? Analyzing the empirical consequences of laws and the specific laws that create the most disputes so that you can use the data to then go back and guide legislative reforms. You can use the data to study the impact of executive actions, like say debt recovery tribunals, studying the impacts of judicial strengthening, which we just saw, and then also using the data to design reforms, okay? So in particular, where should we use technology? So a lot of the technology discourse happens kind of very, there's a lot of tech optimism that often doesn't work, and so you really need the data to identify where the binding constraint in the system is so that you can deploy the technology appropriately, okay? So I'm done, sorry, but hopefully, that gives you enough food for thought over the next 2 days. So thank you.
Thank you, Karthik, and I'm sure there's much to think about. And as you were speaking, I was reflecting on my own work, wearing a different hat, running a criminal justice program, as to how little we think about, or as lawyers, have the tools to understand state capacity and then shape our rights conversation within that framework. So I'm sure many people here will reflect on what you have said. I know we're running late, but almost seems that given the comments from both Professor Bajpai and Karthik, maybe just a couple of questions or comments from the audience, and we can move to and we're running late for the next session. Professor Bajpai, please. Yeah, just maybe a couple of questions that, yeah. Yes. Yes. Shraddha, yes. Just, if you could just introduce yourself with your name and what you do. Yes.
Yeah, I think technology in general is.
So my name is Shraddha. I'm an assistant professor of law at the BML Munjal University, which is in Gurgaon. My question is to you, Professor Muralidharan. Thanks to both of you for your presentations. I have a very pointed question about the point you raised about the conflict between individual justice and systemic justice vis-a-vis the legal system and the judiciary in particular. And you rightly said that there's a need to find some sort of balance between those two things. I was wondering if you could point out some concrete ways in which that might be done, because then that might be a helpful way for us all to think about this. Thank you.
Thanks. You just take the second question as well. Yeah. I think Nimisha had a question. Yeah.
Good morning. I'm Nimisha Shrivastava. I'm heading Council to Secure Justice, an organization that works on child rights and access to justice. Professor Muralidharan, thank you so much. That was a brilliant presentation. So you one of your slides mentioned that India is a paperwork state. And we also, in so much of our work come across so much paperwork. So, what is paperwork and what is data collection, and how do you sort of differentiate between the two? Because there is plenty of paperwork that is going around, but then again, I think that's just conflated very often. Yeah.
And Professor Bajpai, if I could just add a third question, and we can just have the responses. In imagination of legal research in the criminal justice space, how do we sort of try and incorporate these elements of state capacity and governance? Because so many of those rights questions seem so intertwined with what we think of studying, what we think of reform as, what we think of as proposals. How do we incorporate that into a sort of legal research agenda? So if we can just start with Professor Muralidharan, and yeah.
Is this working? Yeah. So, like I said, this is the first time I've actually presented to a legal audience, and I'm really excited to kind of begin many conversations, right? So I think the answer partly to what Anup said, and I forgot your name, Shraddha, right? See, I think is pretty much to kind of have a more disciplined process of passing laws that are kind of accompanied by allocation of adequate resources, right? I mean, for the implementation of that. So one of the quips I have, which I even put in the book, is to say that often in India, the first arm of the government, which is, so the legislature often passes laws and entitlements that are beyond the capacity of the executive to deliver. And then you end up with the third arm of the state, which is the judiciary, holding the second arm in contempt of the first arm, okay? Because, that you haven't delivered what is in the law. And then the executive is chasing its own tails, like, trying. So everybody is doing what is correct as per their role, but they're tying the system collectively in knots, okay? So one way to balance this issue of individual justice and kind of aggregate service delivery would be, again, to use the data, right? To say, okay, how much of this is a case of individual injustice because this particular plaintiff did not get it, versus how much of this is reflecting certain systemic failures, right? That you don't have the staffing, you don't have the resources, and then the nature of the judgment can then be less about directing the state to provide recourse to the individual plaintiff and more about saying this, you've got to systematically make these investments, okay? So I'll give you another very powerful example of data from my own work, okay? And this goes back to the controversy around Aadhaar, about both the trade-off between reducing leakage and the risk of exclusion, okay? So, and I've been working on this for over 10 years, right? And so what you saw in Bihar, in Jharkhand where we did the work, is that see, both sides were right, okay? So when you rolled out the Aadhaar, you cut out a lot of ghosts, you cut out a lot of, a lot of leakage was cut. But it is also true that a certain number of beneficiaries were excluded because they had not seeded their cards in time, okay? So what the activists and the justice folks were focusing on those folks who were being excluded. And even though it was only 2%, in India, that's 20 million people, right? Like, so you have kind of two well-intentioned groups arguing from opposite ends of the distribution, because the truth is where you are in that distribution. So having systematic data, right, then allows you to both narrow down where the problem is and saying, and we've then, because I've been working on PDS for over 15 years, right? So we've then developed these systems of external outbound call centers, right? So what happens with inbound calls is that gives you grievances, but the outbound calls is what helps you understand, is there a systemic issue or an individual issue, right? So a lot of this then goes back to investing in the data systems to improve state capacity and performance more broadly. And I think there's no easy solution, right? So all I want to provoke right now is kind of bringing that lens of state capacity into the entire justice conversation, and then hopefully, we end up in a better place. I think the second question was, sorry,
Nimisha.
Paperwork. Yeah, so absolutely, right? And I think there is this fetish in the system of saying we need more data. And again, one of the things that I've been doing, not just in my research, but last 5 years, we built a non-profit called CGIS, which is the Center for Effective Governance of Indian States, where we do a lot of work on ground level implementation and state level finance issues. And so what you see, I'll give you a simple example, okay? So in WCD, which is Women and Child Development, right? So Government of India has this thing called a Portion Tracker, where they're trying to track kind of at the last mile different aspects of nutrition measurement, which they are mandating everywhere, okay? But some states like Telangana, Tamil Nadu, they had their own systems, okay? Because they wanted to track their own schemes. So in the end, that poor frontline worker, the digitization was supposed to reduce paperwork, but it actually doubled it, okay? Because you're still having to keep it on paper and record it in two systems, which is why there is no substitute for actually going and doing a workflow analysis, time use analysis. So some of our reform work that we did in Panchayati Raj in Telangana, which was then about improving performance measurement and management for the frontline panchayat secretaries. The first thing we did was actually go see that they were collecting data on 160 different indicators, okay? And 80 of these were completely irrelevant. So, but the first part was just first simplifying what had to be collected, then adding the technology, then making sure that the data was feeding back into decision making. This is the dynamic data that, that Professor Bajpai was talking about, because the whole system collects data to show data collection ho gaya, right? But there is nothing in there that is using the data for better decision making, right? So then you got to, so we've been doing a bunch of work on this, and again what you realize that data collection is just the beginning, and then there's a whole culture of data use where the data then drives decision making as opposed to kind of reporting. And the interesting thing, my last point, is how do you solve this problem of data fudging, okay? And you go to the ground and you see that from the perspective of the frontline worker, it is completely rational to inflate the data, okay? Because if not, you're going to just get yelled at, okay? So in the government, given that there are no managerial tools, you can't pay for performance, you can't promote for performance. So the only managerial tool you have is shouting, okay? So if you've been, I'm not kidding, okay? So if you've sat in government offices, essentially you manage by shouting, okay? And the frontline guy doesn't want to be shouted at, okay? So is it like, I mean, theek hai, dikha do jo aapko dekhna hai, I've shown you on paper, right? So, but part of getting that frontline worker invested in data accuracy, right, is kind of making them empowered to see that the right data is not just something that's going to be used to beat them, but it's something that empowers them to do their job better, okay? So what we've started doing in the case of the Anganwadi workers is to say, listen, the policy will provide extra money for the malnourished child if you are in fact willing to record this child as malnourished, okay? So then the data is not just a tool for some external force beating down on you, but becomes a tool for empowering you to do your job better, okay? And that's why this is such a wicked problem, because you got to work through the entire level of the system and understand the incentives and constraints at every level in the system. So that's why, you know, I conclude in the book, right, high-income countries took 100 years to build an effective state, okay? So this is a 25-year project. It's not an overnight project, but part of the goal here is to kind of open up that conversation and saying that it is the great unfinished task of Indian democracy itself, okay, is that of building a more effective state, and this is something that's going to take a village, and we're just getting started. So, thank you.
Thank you. Professor Bajpai.
Yeah. Yeah, Anup, so the idea of bringing this entire discourse at the level of legal research, I personally feel there are two very, important obstacles. One is that a lot of imagination about criminal justice system in this country, even with younger generation, is at that very abstract level. Challenge is how to translate those abstract ideas and understanding of criminal justice system at the level of data. So we understand justice, we understand adjudication, we understand the different aspects of criminal justice. But can we say something, or can we comment something on those aspects of criminal justice is through a data set? So translating the abstract understanding into the empirical understanding is a challenge. And for that, the major thing which I find lacking is the capacity. So our capacity building has to be done so that we are able to really train our young researchers, what I call thinking empirically and doing empirically. This is very important. This is the tagline for all of us. So if you see, the World Justice Report has tried to calculate the index of justice. This is a happening. I'm not saying our World Happiness Report has brought that qualitative understanding of happiness at the level of empirical understanding. So empirical understanding of criminal justice system is much more important in today's context, because I would say that India is often criticized for not having enough data to support a lot of things which it continues to claim in many places. And data governance in this country is a crisis, because data are not consciously collected to qualify some policy imperatives in this country. Rather, it is a sideshow for various reasons. It's a ritualistic thinking that we should have some data to display, because data look fine. Our romance with data is very spurious. It's not genuine. Oh. Yeah. So my understanding is that we have to be genuinely in romance with data in order to back those governance aspect of criminal justice system adequately. And for that, probably we have to move from merely being doers of users of criminal justice rather than doers of criminal justice. So we are the users of data. We are not the generators of criminal justice. Like the Project 39A report on death penalty brought a lot of understanding about death penalty. Not only understanding, it is giving, a venue for many to use that data. So data generation is very important. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for, I think that does a great job of setting up the next day and a half or so now, in terms of the kind of things we need to think about as well, in terms of, in addition to the things that so many of us in this room have been doing, and the idea was to provide certain ideas to think about how how we might adapt our work, new work that we can do, and so I mean, and very important as I think about it, to say that our research agenda is not controlled by what is available to us. That to truly understand it, we need to find ways to generate data. And of course, there are significant implications of that, how in terms of resources, knowledge, know-how, personnel, all of that. I'm sure many of that will get picked up in the later sessions. But just wanted to thank all three of you for setting it up so beautifully. And just a last comment on just the next day and a half. Look, the idea is that, and the idea for not making it a public event is that many of us are invested in this from multiple perspectives. And the idea is not just to have a Q&A type session, and the sessions are longer, significantly longer than usual, so that everybody has enough time to input and say whatever they want to say. You don't necessarily have to respond or question what the panelists are saying in the next 4 sessions. And I hope you will actively participate. It's as much as we want to blur that distinction between panelist and participant, and I hope all of you will contribute to that process. So we will have a very, very strict 10-minute break. We are about 30 minutes behind schedule now, and we need to make that up, and I assume lunch will suffer. But if we can be back absolutely within 10 minutes after everyone has a water, washroom, tea break. Right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Anyway, I knew, time would be.
Thank you.
Hopefully.